Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I do other podcasts. I'm not like trying to two-time you or anything. I don't know. I got some other things I want to talk about. Got to do some other podcasts too, but you're my only daily podcast. And it's really important to me that you know that, and that's the place you occupy in my heart. I do one called No Dumb Questions with my buddy Destin Sandlin. He's got a YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day. He does super well with that. That's one where he's a rocket scientist and I'm just some guy. And then we pick a topic and he rocket sciences it and I just some guy it. And it's fun. We have a nice time with it. And a lot of people seem to like it, which is a really neat thing. And then I got this other one that's pretty obscure called Ironwood Rhino, and I've been doing it for not quite a year. And the reason that I do this podcast is because I really like epistemology, and I guess that's a fancy word for thinking about how you know stuff, theories of knowledge, things like that. And people have wondered about that since the dawn of time. And one of the things that I remember from college philosophy class is, well, meeting my wife on the first day. I remember that for sure. Another thing that I remember were all of the debates about knowledge and knowing stuff, and all of these interesting examples these ancient Greek philosophers came up with for the limits of knowledge, or what faculties we use to gain knowledge, or can you know anything without actually encountering it with your five senses? Does that really count as knowledge? And as life went on and I kept thinking about that stuff, I was like, you know what's a really fun exercise for thinking about knowledge and knowing and proof and how you know if something's real or not is the weird outlier stories, the stuff that people tell you around campfires. That stuff gets fun. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to make a podcast about it. And so I made a podcast, and we've only done like 13 episodes in the whole year. But the thrust of it is that somebody comes on and they tell me a story about their weirdest outlier experience. And then we work together to try to figure out what the heck happened there and try to get to the bottom of it and try to figure out how we know what's real and what's not. And the idea is that each conversation puts one more little tool in the tool belt for thinking about knowing stuff. Well, as the year's gone along, and as I've received tons of stories and feedback from people, every single one of which I've appreciated, I've noticed some patterns. And one of those patterns is that one of the most common types of stories I hear from people are premonition style stories, where they sensed something before it happened. They had a feeling that something big was going down and they dismissed it, but it turns out that at exactly that moment, something big was going down somewhere else with their family or with planet Earth or some set of circumstances. And they're really interesting stories to try to unpack, because I suppose you could dismiss them all as coincidence, and surely that is the explanation for many, maybe even most premonition stories. But some of these stories I hear are so dang specific and precise in their timing that you have to admit that even though you could chalk it up to just a fluke, it's still pretty compelling, and you got to sit there and dwell on a little bit to figure out what you do with that kind of story to find peace in your brain again about your understanding of how the world operates. All of that is not to say go listen to the Ironwood Rhino podcast, but if you happen to, I wouldn't argue. I think it's fun. There's a reason I do it. Some people seem to like it. You can give it a try if you want to. Maybe you've got a story you'd like to come on there. That'd be great also. No, all of that is primarily to say that we get one of those premonition kind of predictive things from Jesus right here in Matthew chapter 26 about where they're going to set up for the Passover meal. And again, outside looking in, as we discussed yesterday, you might think, like, it's just not that big a concern. It's not that big a deal. You're just having a meal somewhere. Like, we debate this after work every day. Should we go to Arby's, go get a drink somewhere? What should we do? But it's a bigger deal here because, again, as we discussed yesterday, we're talking about a gigantic holiday event. Think New Year's Eve in Times Square. You're not just going to show up last minute and grab an Airbnb right on Times Square. Like, that's the kind of thing you'd have to map out in advance. The original audience would have known that even the suggestion that they were still going to get a room and set up shop and do the full Passover meal on such short notice was a pretty ludicrous proposition in and of itself. This does not hit as hard for you and me because culturally we're not there, but that's why we put the time into it over the last couple of days. All right, here's the premonition. I don't know. Is it a premonition when you're holding yourself out as being God in the flesh? Here's the prediction that apparently came true. So Matthew 26, we'll pick it up with yesterday's verse 17. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparation for you to eat the Passover?" Verse 18, he replied, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him the teacher says, 'My appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover." I like understated humor. That works really, really well for me, where it's almost inverse sarcasm, where somebody will crack a joke by saying a thing really, really lightly that is obviously very profound. Matthew seems to resonate with that kind of humor or that style of communication as well. And so you got this gigantic scheduling conundrum and this weird way of resolving it. Like, just go find this mysterious man. He's by the gate. Tell him that we're doing this thing and that we're doing this at his house and it should all work out. And then Matthew just goes on to be like, and so they did, and it worked. And that's it. That's all we get from that. Luke, however, gets a little bit deeper into the circumstances. That is Luke 22. I did not know that off of the top of my head. I had to look in the margin of my little Bible here because it tells us where those things are. It's Luke 22, 7 through 13. I tell you that because it is very important for me to remind you that you can handle the Bible. Then the people who make the Bible on the internet have the power of editing, so it makes it look like we know more stuff than we actually know. Everybody can do this. Okay, Luke 22:7. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Oh, okay, sounds like Matthew. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." Still sounds like Matthew. "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upper room, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. Okay, possibilities here. Possibility number one, it's just like what we were talking about on the front end with Ironwood Rhino. It's a premonition, but more than a premonition because it's God in the flesh. And so Jesus knew exactly where this meal was going to happen because he's going to initiate like the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist there. It's kind of a huge theological deal for all of eternity. And for every single one of you who goes to church and is taking communion anytime in the last several weeks, that flows directly out of this scene. If there's no room to do that, maybe we don't get the Lord's Supper. Like I said, it's a pretty huge deal. Millions, billions upon billions of people have partaken in the institution that Jesus is about to establish here. Possibility number one, it was entirely prophetic. Jesus anticipated a thing. The disciples are so used to him being right on things like this that they're just like, great, roger that. Yeah, we'll find the guy with the jar. It'll work out. Possibility number two, this is like some kind of secret society thing where a bunch of people knew that Jesus might be hitting them up to have this meal, and word had circulated, and there was a certain code that you needed to say, and so Jesus knew that this was going to go to plan entirely, and in fact, he set this thing up in advance discreetly so that he couldn't be arrested just yet, because we know that the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders, they want to arrest Jesus. They want to do it at night. They want to do it right now. Judas is looking for opportunities to sell him out. Jesus, we're going to see, is completely in the loop on that. He's aware of Judas's behavior and the plot. He's been predicting that all of this was going to happen since before Judas even signed on to the plot. Jesus is no coward, but he is definitely managing the timeline of his life and his death and execution and resurrection very carefully. So we've seen him many times slip out of trouble. People wanted to throw him off of a cliff earlier on in his ministry up north, and he was like, I'm just going to walk through the crowd. It's not my time to be getting thrown off of cliffs. I ain't doing it. And so we've seen him take self-preserving measures because it wasn't his time. And even though it's just barely not his time yet, apparently it's still not his time for reasons that I mentioned here a few minutes ago. Now, look, we've got twin incidents here. As Jesus comes into town, remember we have the go get me a certain type of donkey from a certain place incident. And that has the same tone here. Like this is either a miraculous prediction and the same power that caused the disciples to just drop their nets and follow Jesus. And he was like, yeah, come follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. And they're like, okie dokie. Maybe that power was at work here. Or maybe you've got some kind of Mission Impossible spies underground. We've coordinated this in this way because we need to have this one more meal and we don't want the trap to snap shut just yet kind of thing. I would tend to believe the latter. In Matthew 10, Jesus said he was going to send people out like sheep among wolves. I mean, he understands what planet Earth is like, and his instruction is be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. I suspect that he arranged something here that the disciples did not know about so that they would have plausible deniability, and only when the time was exactly right did he pull the thing off. Or maybe he just broke the laws of time and space in a way that was really, really subtle and would blow people's minds because of how absolutely impossible it was to get reservations at that time of year on such short notice for the Passover. Could go either way. Whatever the case, Matthew thought it was important to include these details about how it went down. And it's worth noting that Matthew doesn't tip his hand towards something supernatural having occurred here. Rather, Matthew seems to be answering a question that normal readers, people who are familiar with this, remember his audience is Jewish, they go to this festival in that town as well. And it looks like maybe he views this as being one of the least plausible parts of this whole story of Jesus. Like, yeah, walking on water, casting out demons, causing organic material to grow back out of nothing. Yeah, that I could believe. But getting reservations on Passover Eve in the city walls of Jerusalem? I think not. So maybe Matthew just feels the pressure to explain how that worked out and let the reader understand as they read between the lines of why Jesus approached his booking in this unusual way. However you slice it, it still lands in the same place, and that is that we are set up for the Last Supper, and the very next scene is going to start with this. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and a lot of famous stuff happens in that scene that we will look at next. I told you about that Ironwood Rhino podcast. The stories are really interesting, and interesting enough that it inspired Jeff and I to make an album about several of the episodes. I realize how utterly ridiculous that sounds, by the way. We have released one of the songs from that album over on the Ironwood Rhino podcast, but if you are a patron of the program here at the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, I am going to link you to the second track, which has not seen the light of day at all. This will be the first little hint of it that anybody gets to encounter. The song is called Premonition. Jeff and I are both on this one. Jeff is the talent. I help out a little bit. So anything you don't like is my fault, and anything that's awesome was definitely him. Again, the song is called Premonition. If you are a patron, go over to patreon.com, and it'll be available to all of you who are supporting at any level whatsoever, and I hope you like the song. Into the Last Supper tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.